Today I'm going to show you how to use gradients in Adobe Photoshop. Gradients are one of Photoshop's most powerful and useful tools. Not only can they be used to add highlights and shadows to images very quickly, they can also be used to add dramatic effects to an image, creating the illusion of light and deep shadows. So you can take a very ordinary image and make it far more dramatic by using a gradient. Gradients are also essential when it comes to compositing images and using them to hide or reveal part of an image with a layer mask. They're also essential to creating the illusion of 3D. If you look around the room you're in, nearly every surface is a gradient. There's almost no surface that's perfectly flat or even. First, we're just going to have some fun exploring the gradient tool and the gradient editor so you can get comfortable with it and get a feel for what it's capable of. Then we'll look at using gradients in a more practical way to composite and manipulate photographic images by using them on layer masks, adjustment layers, and smart objects. Gradients are one of my favorite Photoshop tools, and I think you're going to see why once you've completed this tutorial. Okay, let's get started. Go ahead and open up Photoshop, and let's create a new document. Command-N or Control-N on the PC. And let's choose Print, Letter, and Create. Okay, the Gradient tool is about halfway down the tool panel, or the key command is G. So let's go ahead and press G. And when we access the Gradient tool, our Options panel changes to give us access to different features for the Gradient tool. These little icons right here are styles, and we're going to be exploring those in a minute. If you click the downward arrow here, you have access to the current presets. If you click the color bar here, you open up the Gradient editor. So 3 of these presets, this one, and this one, are determined by what colors you currently have in your tool panel. Since I have black and white, these are black and white, black and black. These others are standard presets that come with Photoshop. You do have access to lots of other gradients by clicking on the gear right here and coming down in here. So these are all collections of gradients. We're not going to load those right now. To modify a gradient, you could do several things. You could change the colors in your tool panel, or you can modify them using this color bar here. These squares along the top are called opacity stops. When you click on one of them, the opacity value will show right here. The squares on the bottom are color stops. And you can modify a color either by double-clicking on the color stop, which opens up the color picker. Let's change this to a blue. And let's change this one to a lighter blue. Now we're going from 100% to 100%. That means our gradient will entirely fill the layer and you will not see any of the layers below. If we want to save this gradient so we can access it later, you can click New and it will add it to your list of presets. Let's say OK. Now we're going to work non-destructively, so we're going to put everything on separate layers. So let's create a new layer, and I'll just call this one Sky. The way the Gradient tool works is you click and drag. Say we click at the top and drag all the way down to the bottom, you're going to get a very gradual gradation. And if you hold the Shift key, it will constrain it to keep it at 90-degree angle. If you do a very short drag, you can get almost a hard line. Holding the Shift key will allow you to go at 45 degrees, 90 degrees horizontal, or 90 degrees vertical. Okay, let's create a very gradual gradation by again clicking at the top and dragging all the way down to the bottom. Now we're going to explore creating our own custom gradient. So let's open the Gradient editor. We're going to start with this preset, orange, yellow, orange. And we're going to drag the stops in close to the center here. So drag both of the opacity stops and both of the color stops in towards the center. Something like that. And try to get them symmetrical if you can. Now we want this to go to transparency by just clicking right next to the existing one and changing the value to 0. The tighter it is to the previous one, the harder the edge is going to be when we create our gradient. Once you've created an opacity or color stop, you can simply click on another area of the bar and it will copy and paste that value. Now let's save this one. by clicking on the new. Let's create a new layer. We'll call this cone 1. Now let's change to this third button here, the angle gradient. Click approximately in the middle of your image and drag, holding the shift key. And you get something like this. It looks like a cone. Let's make a new layer. Command Shift N, Control Shift N on the PC, and we'll call this one cone 2. And we'll click and drag at the same point, but click and drag down this time. And you get something like this. We can use our Move tool to bump that over so that they line up more perfectly. All right, let's create a sphere. So we'll create a dark sphere first, and then a lighter sphere on top of it to make it look more dimensional. So create a new layer, dark sphere, say OK. Choose our gradient tool. Let's change our foreground color to a dark purple. And this time let's choose the second icon, the radial gradient, and let's choose the second preset, foreground to transparent. This by far is the most valuable of all the presets in my opinion. Now if you click on the gradient editor, you're going to see that this goes from 100% to 0% opacity, and it's going to be very gradual change. If we want to have a harder edge, we need to get these two closer together. So let's slide them over a little bit. Take this one about to here, and maybe this one over here. And the closer we get, the harder the edge will be on our sphere. Let's add this to our presets by clicking New and say OK. Now I'm going to click in the middle. Again, make sure you're on the radial gradient. Click in the middle and drag out. Now it doesn't really matter if you hold the Shift key or not because it's a circle, so it doesn't really make any difference. I'd like to make that a little bit larger, so I'm just going to drag it out a little bit farther. I think that's good. Now let's do a white sphere on top of this one. Make a new layer. We can change our foreground color to white by pressing D for default, and that gets to pure black and white here in the tool panel, and then you can hit X to toggle foreground background. So now we're on white, we're still on the radial style, and we're still on the second preset, foreground to transparent. Now this has gone back to the default of being 100% on one side and 0 on the other. I'm going to leave it at that and see what happens. I think it might be a nice effect. So I'll click and drag. I think it's a little too big, so I'm going to Command Z and drag not so far. Okay, I kind of like that. That creates sort of the illusion of a sphere, a very soft sphere. Now, because we've created everything on separate layers, we can change the stacking order. I'm going to go ahead and drag my layer panel out here and show you what happens when I move these things around. I'm going to move the cones above the dark sphere and leave the white sphere on top. Now notice what happens if I put it below. This creates a very different feeling, a different story. If I move the white sphere above the cones, now we create a sense of tension, almost as if energy is being generated here at the point where these two cones meet. We could make this more intense by duplicating this layer, Command J. So I kind of like that. Now let's create another custom layer. So let's go up here. We'll stick with the radial gradient for now. Click on the color bar to open up the gradient editor. And let's start with one of these very colorful striped presets. And I'm going to move this one over towards the middle. And I'll copy and paste this one by clicking on it and then just clicking over here. So what I want to do is just create a series of colors, and I'm really more interested in value than I am in color. So doesn't really matter too much, but we do need to pull in the opacity stops and then add a second opacity stop next to it that will be 0, and then just click next to the other one to copy and paste it over there. I'm going to go ahead and click New to add this to my presets and say OK. Now let's create a new layer, and I'll call this one Striped Circle. And then I'm going to click in the middle and drag. Now at first it looks pretty obnoxious, but if you change the blend mode, you can come up with some very interesting effects. I kind of like the overlay, so I'm going to go with that one for right now. Now you can duplicate this, Command J, and then go to your Move tool, which is V. Let's say we move it straight over. I'll hold the Shift key and then change the blend mode. Let's change it to, say, Dodge. And I'll duplicate it again and drag it over to the other side. By the way, you may want to uncheck Auto Select. Personally, I don't like this feature. I like to have more control over what I select. I don't like it to automatically select for me. I'm going to move this one up on top and just try different things. Because we have everything on different layers, you can change the opacity as well as the blend mode. I'll change this one down to like 40%, and this one also down to 40. And I'm just playing around here. I'm not trying to really create anything specific. I'm just exploring how the tool works. That's what I want you to do. Just have some fun and play around here. Let's take a look at one other of the styles. Let's try this one here, the reflected gradient, and let's load one of the other presets. How about metals? And we will choose Append to add it to our preset gallery here. I'll click on this one so it looks kind of silver-like. Now I do want this to go to transparent on the edges. So we're going to have to move this in, and then make a new opacity stop right next to this one and change the value to 0. And then we can just click next to the other one, and it will add it over there. I'll move this over. This will change where the center of the gradient is. I'll add this to my presets and say OK. OK, now I'm going to make a new layer. And I'll just call this one Reflect. Say OK, and then click and hold the Shift key and drag down. OK, kind of interesting. Let's try that on different blend modes and see what happens. Now that's kind of cool. I sort of like that. Now let's try something really crazy. Let's add another new layer, and we can just call this one Multi-Stripes. On Difference. Now what we're going to do is choose one of the presets. So it's pretty random at this point. Maybe I'll just choose this very colorful one. I'm going to leave it just the way it is, say OK. I'm going to work with the Reflect, but I'm going to change the blend mode here to Difference. Now you've got to be careful with this, because this blend mode and this blend mode are not the same thing. This blend mode affects the way this layer or any of the layers interact with the layers below. This affects the way the tool behaves. So you need to be sure that you change it back to normal when you're done playing around. Otherwise, the next time you want to use the tool, it's not going to behave the way you expect it to, and you're going to get very frustrated. Okay, now what we're going to do is just going to click and drag, 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 and I'm just randomly trying different things. Okay, so it's pretty crazy. So I'm going to drag it all the way down below the sky, and then try different blend modes on sky and see what happens when I blend sky with the multi-striped difference. So you can see we get all kinds of interesting effects. I kind of like pin light. I think I'll go with pin light. And then I'm going to make this effect a little more subtle by changing the opacity of the multi-striped layer. Something like that. Okay, so what I want you to do now is just play around, have some fun, try some different things. Make sure you change this back to normal before you forget. For example, you might want to rotate this one. Let's duplicate the layer, Command J, and then let's rotate it. Command T, and let's pull it around. Hold the Shift key and it'll go to 45 or 60 degrees. Then I'm going to pull it out, and if you hold down the Command and the Option, you can pull it out, hit Return, or hit the check bar. Let's try changing the stacking order of this one. I'm going to duplicate this and rotate this one the other way. So hit Return or hit the check mark. So just have some fun turning these things on and off, moving them around, and trying different gradients, and just seeing what you can come up with. As long as you work on separate layers, you don't paint yourself into a corner, and you can keep trying different things. Okay, go ahead and open up Woman on Turquoise. I'm going to collapse the panels over here by clicking on the double-headed arrow in the upper right. And I do want the Layers panel out, so I'll go ahead and drag that one out and open it up. All right, so let's say that this is a photograph for a magazine article. We just want to add some drama to this page, make the story more interesting, and bring more attention to the woman's face. Let's start by creating a new layer and just call it shadow or whatever makes sense to you. And say OK. Choose the gradient tool by pressing G. Once you're in the gradient tool, you can just simply use the Option key to sample a color. So I'm going to sample a color from her top right around in here. Make sure that you're on the second preset, foreground to transparent, and click OK. Start dragging from just left of her forehead where the highlight is. I want all of her hair and her back to be in the shadow. So I'm just going to click and drag slightly downward towards the right. Now you might have to do this a few times to get it right. I actually think that's not bad. See what it looks like when I lower the opacity and change the blend mode to multiply. All right, I think that's working pretty well. So immediately the image is far more dramatic and it feels much more intense emotionally. Our attention is focused on the woman, and we now have an area up here in the left that's perfect for adding some type. I'm just going to select the Type tool, click and drag to define a text area, and it will automatically be filled with lorem ipsum placeholder text. I'll click the color swatch here to change the color. I'll just sample the background color here and then make it a little bit lighter so it pops out a little bit more and a little bit more neutral. I think something like that is good. Okay, now you can click this icon right here to access the characters and paragraph panel. My leading or line spacing is currently at 21.4, so it's quite open. And I think that looks really nice. I might open it even further by holding the Option or Alt key and pressing the down arrow. See how that looks? I'm going to change the line length a little bit on some of these just because I think it'll look better. So usually when you have a flush left, ragged right, you like to have a certain amount of variation on the ragged side so it looks more interesting. If it's close to being aligned and not perfectly aligned, then that's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. So I just edited the type for appearance so that we have a flush left and then we have a pretty good rag here on the right, without being too extreme. If you press the Tab key, it'll hide all of your tools and you can see what the image looks like against a plain background. Using gradients on layer mask is extremely important when it comes to compositing images. Now, if you're going to be doing really tight, very realistic looking compositing, you're probably going to have to use the selection tools and brushes. So we're going to be doing more what I would say is artistic compositing, not intended to look realistic. So go ahead and open up both bridge.psd and manandhoodie.psd. Let's collapse all these panels over here by clicking on the arrows in the upper right, and let's go ahead and drag out the layers panel and open it up. Click on Man and Hoodie, and with the move tool, so that's V, drag him up, move over this tab, and then down into the middle of the image. And that will copy and paste him into this image. Okay, so let's place him somewhere here on the right. And let's add a layer mask simply by clicking this icon down here. Okay, now we're going to use the gradient tool, hit G. Make sure that you are on foreground to transparent and that your foreground color is black. So you can press D to get to pure black and white and then X to bring the black to the foreground color. Make sure you're working on the mask and then let's click just below the top of the image here and drag down. You can hold the Shift key to go straight. And then the same thing on the left side. Let's click and drag to the right. Something like that. Now to colorize him, to bring him into the same color range as the bridge image, we're going to use a solid fill layer. Hold down the Option key and click this circle down here and choose Solid Color. And we'll just call this Colorized Man. We do want to use the previous layer as a clipping mask. Now we can come out here and sample one of these blue colors from the image. Say OK. And then let's change the blend mode to multiply or to color. I think color is going to help him stand out a little bit better. I will lower the opacity of the color layer to make it a little bit more neutral. Now the beauty of using these solid fill vector layers is you can double click on them and you can sample other colors from the image to see what that would look like. I think that works pretty well. I'll say OK. Okay, so now let's add an effect using one of our previously created custom gradients. So let's click on the gradient bar. Let's choose the stripe gradient we created from the silver preset and click OK. We want this to be non-destructive, so it has to be on a new layer. So I'll just call this one Stripes and say OK. Okay, and now I want to make sure that you choose the fourth button here, which is the Reflect style. Click in the middle of the image, hold the Shift key and drag down, something like that. Now, these are too heavy. I want them to resemble the lights on the bridge. So I'm going to press Command T for the transform tool, hold down the Option and the Shift key and drag these together so that they get much more narrow. Something like that, I think, will work. Click the check mark to perform the transformation. Hit V for the Move tool. Turn off Auto Select. Make sure that you're on your stripe layer, and then let's move this into place. Okay, now let's add a layer mask to our stripes layer. I'm going to choose my gradient tool. I'm going back to my foreground to transparent. I'm going to switch to the radial style. And I'm going to click and drag where his eyes are. Maybe something like that. I'm going to switch to the linear style and drag from the right over, holding the Shift key. And then also maybe from the left over, holding the Shift key. Sort of like that. Now I'm going to lower the opacity so it's not quite so intense. Maybe I'll lower the opacity just a little bit more. And possibly do another radial gradient around his eyes so that get a little bit more of his eyes showing. Okay, now let's crop the image. So here's the crop tool here. Click the check mark to perform the transformation. Now this is a destructive move, so you'd want to do a save as on this so that your original composite has all of the information and all of the imagery in it. Okay, now I think I'm going to move the lines down just a little bit so that they align better with the lights on the bridge. And maybe lower the opacity just a bit more. Okay, do a save as. Let's move on to the next one. Now, open up elegantwoman.psd. One of the great features Photoshop gives us for working non-destructively is the ability to add effects or filters to our images without damaging the image in any way. Select the layer that you want to add the effect to, go up to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters, and it says this will convert this into a smart object, and you say OK. When it makes it into a smart object, it keeps a copy of the original in the background, embedded in the document, which you can access at any time. So now we could add filters to this layer without causing any harm at all to the original image. And we can modify the effect at any time. So let's go ahead and add a blur effect. We're going to add a box blur. Going to make it fairly extreme. Let's say somewhere in the 25 range. Say OK. Now the smart filters come with a mask. So by painting either black or white on the smart filter mask, we can either hide or reveal that effect, that filter. So I'm going to use the gradient tool, and I'm going to use the Radial Gradient, foreground to transparent. I want to hide the effect on her face so that her face is sharp, but then the edges are out of focus. So I'm going to paint with black, click and drag on her face, something like that. Let's add a solid fill layer that's going to become a background layer. Just make it black, and we can name it background. You can just double click on the name to name it. And I'm going to drag this down below our woman image. Now I'm going to click on the woman and add a layer mask to the woman, and then use a linear gradient to composite the woman or hide the left edge of the woman's image to reveal the black background. So I'm just going to click and drag, and maybe come again up from the bottom, click and drag a couple of times. Something like that. Now, because we've used smart filters, you can always go back, double click on the effect, and either intensify it, increase it, or reduce it. You can modify a mask any number of ways. For example, you can option click on the mask itself to see what the mask looks like. You can actually work on the mask itself. You can also click the link between the image and the mask, and then you can use the Move tool to move the mask. In this case, I'm going to move it just slightly to the left so we get a little bit more of a highlight around the back of her hair, and then I will relink the image and the mask. Okay, now we're going to have some fun using gradients to create a simple movie poster. Go ahead and open up seriousman.psd and couplerunning.psd. Okay, then let's make a new document. Now the normal size of a movie poster is 27 by 40, and it's at least 300 pixels per square inch. Often it'll be 600 pixels per square inch. Movie posters are typically very high resolution. So we're going to do it at half size. So we'll do it 13.5 by 20 at 300 pixels per square inch. Create. Now let's bring Serious Man into our new document by clicking and dragging him in and dragging back down. And I'll place him approximately in this area. I'm going to click on the background, press I to get the eyedropper to sample the color in the background of Serious Man, and then I'll fill our background layer with that color by pressing Option Delete. That fills it with the foreground color. Okay, now we're going to add an effect to the man. So we're going to convert this layer into a smart object. Say OK. The effect we're going to add is a blur, motion blur. So it's going to be blurred horizontally. So make sure this line is going horizontally. And I've got it blurring out to about 90 pixels. It's just going to add a little bit of a stressful appearance to him. We're going to then click on the mask for the smart filter, use our gradient tool, and this time we're going to use the Radial Gradient, foreground to transparent. I'm going to make sure I'm on the smart filter mask, and I'm going to click right in his eye and drag out a little ways to reveal the original image. So that part of the image will be sharp, and then the rest of it is motion blurred. Now let's add a mask to the man layer itself so that we can get rid of any hard edges. Make sure no hard edges show when this thing goes to print. So I'm actually going to turn off the background so we can just see the edges of our layer here. Again with the gradient tool, linear style, foreground to transparent. I'll hold down the shift key and make sure I'm inside the black area and drag up. And inside the black area over here. Same deal here. This will make sure that we don't have any hard edges. I'll turn the background back on. And I actually think I'm going to click and drag a little bit into his face to darken this side of his head. And maybe get rid of his neck or shirt or whatever it is that I'm seeing right here a little bit. All right, I think that looks pretty good. Okay, now let's take our couple running and let's move them on into our poster comp here. I'm going to name the layer couple. A lot of times what I'll do is add a hide all layer mask. So that's going to conceal the entire layer, and then I will use white to slowly bring back the image just where I want it to appear. So in that case, we're going to work with the gradient tool again. We will work with white and the radial. Shift click on the mask to turn it off for a minute so we get an idea of where our couple is. Then I'll turn it back on, and then I'll click and drag and start to reveal them. Now, that was too much. I want them to blend pretty rapidly into the background, and I want to make sure I am not seeing a hard edge here. So I'll turn off the back. I think it's a little bit of a hard edge right there. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my linear gradient, switch to black, and make sure that this edge is masked out. Maybe I will move them over a little bit, so they'd probably be around in here. And if this is a real movie poster, we probably have a billing block down here on the bottom, and maybe a copy line in here. We're going to put the title right up here across his eyes. Choose the rectangle tool, make the fill color white, and create a very narrow line across the image. Something like that. I'm going to use the move tool and just move it down so that it goes straight through his eye. Let's add a mask to the rectangle. This will be a linear foreground to transparent with black as our foreground color. And I'll just get rid of these edges so it looks kind of pointed on the end. It's going to look kind of like a needle going through his eye. Then I'm going to switch to the radial gradient and make it disappear right where it goes through the eye. Now I'm going to switch to the type tool. Just going to click up here and type escape. All right, so we want this to be in white. You can open up the character panel by clicking right here, and we can change the color either here or here. Let's go in here, change it to white. I've got mine set to 87 point, Arial black. I think that's what I'll go with. Anything that looks good to you, anything you like is fine. I think the size is about right. So I'll say OK and close that up. And then take the move tool and move this down so that it just crosses right through those E's. Now one other thing I want to do is colorize the couple so that they're in the same color range as our serious man here. I'm going to open up my layers panel again. And I can get rid of the characters. Right above couple, I'm going to hold down the Option key and add a solid color. Use previous layer to create a clipping mask. And then I'm going to sample a color from his face. I'll say OK. And then change the blend mode for the color layer to color. Now again, since it's a vector colored layer, you can reopen it and try different colors and see if they work any better for you. I think that looks pretty good. Now what we could do is slightly reduce the color on their face, bring back a little bit of their natural color. To do that, we would work on the layer mask for the solid layer. I'll use the gradient tool, Radial Gradient. Now since we want to hide the layer, this would be black. I'd have to work with black. I'm going to reduce the opacity quite a bit, so I'm going to go down to like 35 and click and drag. Maybe I'll do it once more. I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and save as. I'll call this escape underscore poster and save it. All right, that concludes this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you start having fun using gradients